welcome back to my channel. So I'm carrying on from where I left off, reviewing the invisible doctrine, the secret history of neoliberalism and how it came to control your life. So I just really got up to the bit where, in the book, where he talks about the stifling of hope, the idea that there is no alternative, or TINA, which is what Thatcher used a lot. For example, there is no money. Governments repeatedly seek to persuade us that they are incapable of action. Uselessness is baked in. They can't address poverty, etc. It's beyond their control. This results in the diseases of despair, nihilism, apathy, and obviously then the far right ends up filling this vacuum, because if people feel that there's no hope of anything getting better, and then you have sort of strong men like Trump or say Johnson, people like that, kind of like in a sense beguiling people with their charisma, as it were. This can then kind of result in people becoming persuaded by right-wing slogans. The governments have repeatedly proven to be capable of decisive action when they choose to be, or when circumstances force their hand. Whenever the free market has stumbled, government has intervened without hesitation, for example the financial crisis in 2008 and the COVID pandemic. The only thing that stops the world responding with the same decisive force as it did in the Second World War the greatest crisis humanity ever faced is political will. The greatest crisis humanity has ever faced, is political will. So the only thing that stops the world responding with the same decisive force as it did in the Second World War to the greatest crisis humanity has ever faced is political will. And that greatest crisis that Monbiot is referring to there is, of course, the climate crisis as well, which is very much a product of neoliberalism as well. I'm just going to turn this down a minute, hang on. Sorry, I just had to turn it down, it's a bit distracting me. Okay, so again the book starts talking about the power of story. So after the laissez-faire economics triggered the Great Depression in the 1930s, John Maynard Keynes devised a new economics. Democrats and Republicans, Labour and Conservatives, left and right, all became, in broad terms, Keynesian. It was only when Keynesianism ran into trouble in the 1970s that neoliberals were able to come forward with their own restoration story, which had been honed for 3 decades. As Milton Friedman said, "When the time came, we were ready and we could step straight in." Their story said the disorder that afflicted the land was caused by powerful forces of an overreaching state whose collectivising tendencies had crushed freedom and opportunity. But the hero of their story, the freedom-seeking entrepreneur, will fight those forces, create wealth and opportunity that will trickle down to all, restoring harmony to the land. So that was the kind of restoration story that the neoliberals sold to people, or advertised. And this story also resonated across the political spectrum. So in the same way that Keynesianism had resonated across the political spectrum, the new story of neoliberalism also resonated across the political spectrum. So in a sense, everyone, left and right, became neoliberal. In the Keynesian restoration story, by the way, the economic elite was the enemy, whereas the hero would be the enabling state, generating income and jobs. But the idea here that Monbiot is saying is that we need a story, because stories are very powerful, narrative is very powerful, and in order to mobilise people to support a new idea or a new way of running society, you need to have a story. You need to have something meaningful that people understand, a kind of restoration story. One of the main reasons why neoliberalism, despite all of its failures, continues to dominate our lives is that we have produced no new story for which to replace it. I suppose this is really like talking about, the competition between master narratives is really what this is talking about. What is the current dominant narrative? The current dominant narrative is neoliberalism, but there's no competing narrative to kind of replace it. So what do you do when there's no competing narrative? It becomes very depressing, demoralising, because it appears like there's no alternative, because there isn't a competing persuasive narrative that people can kind of get behind. And you need that. In order to mobilise, you need a competing narrative that really appeals to people in a sense of what is right. So when we have no story that explains the present and describes the future, hope evaporates. Without a restoration story, he says, nothing can change. And then Monbiot looks in a bit at, discusses human nature, and he says that the central crucial characteristic of humanity is not selfishness and greed, but altruism and cooperation. But the dominant political narrative motivates us to live in competition with each other. It encourages conflict, fear, mistrust, and weakens social bonds. Yeah, my own personal view on this is that based on like the science of what makes Homo sapiens Homo sapiens, is that, think about it, we are one of the most adaptive species. That's why humans have been so successful and gone over the whole world, taken over the whole world, is that we can basically thrive in so many different places and so many different ways of living. Like, it's that flexibility, in a sense, that is the reason why humans are so successful. And there's very little, actually, that is hard-baked into human nature. We have a latent capacity for greed, we have a latent capacity for selfishness, but then we also have a latent capacity for cooperation and altruism, and depending what society we live in and the structure of the society, that will determine which of those latent potentials is the most dominant, I would say. I think that's what's really key. So yes, we can be selfish, we can be greedy if we live in a society that encourages those things, but if we live in a society that encourages the other parts of human nature, altruism, cooperation, all those better parts, then we could be those things, because we're not really inherent. There isn't really that much that we inherently are. We are very adaptive, and that's why we're so successful, that we can mutate and change depending on what particular environment we're living in at any time, more than any other animal, really. Although it could be argued quite convincingly that we are maybe more predisposed to altruism and cooperation than we are to selfishness and greed, all being equal. The pendulum arguably swings more in the direction of cooperation, which would make sense from an evolutionary perspective because we are a social species, and if we didn't cooperate, we'd basically die. So, but we do have a latent potential for greed and selfishness, albeit maybe not as strong as the force for cooperation and altruism. But it depends on the society that we live in, which one will be more dominant. That's what I would say. That's my response to that. Just based upon what I know about the species, really, like. That's what makes humans distinct. That we can change who we are considerably depending on the environment that we live in. Because we are basically very much a herd species. So if the majority of the people are acting in selfish ways, it's like a kind of contagion that will encourage everyone to be selfish. But if like the majority of people are cooperating and practicing altruism, and then other people that will kind of have a knock-on effect to others, because in fact we're a herd species and we're highly sociable and influenced by what other people are doing as well. So yeah, it's not the case that we're inherently competitive or inherently selfish. That's very much a modern neoliberal phenomenon that is basically, we've been socialised now like that, so increasingly people are acting in those ways, but it doesn't mean that we're inherently that, we're not. Anyway, I'll digress. So, the dominant political narrative motivates us to live in competition with each other. It encourages conflict, fear, mistrust, and it weakens social bonds. Where there is atomisation, he says, where there is atomisation, we can build a thriving civic life with participatory culture. We can recover democracy from the people who have captured it. And there's very much an emphasis here on local democracy, which is very important. He says the new restoration story, should be about politics of belonging, which can then appeal to many, many people across the political divide. Because among the few values that are shared by left and right is belonging and community. Even fascists seek community and belonging, albeit a disturbing version where everyone looks the same. Search for belonging is a fundamental human need, and steering people away from fascism requires an answer to the need for belonging. Fascism seeks a bonding network that brings together people from a homogeneous group. The antithesis is a bridging network which brings together people from different groups. So the new restoration story, he says, could be the following. Disorder afflicts the land, but the heroes are the common people, long deprived of democratic power, and they can revolt, they can build collaborative, inclusive, generous communities to restore a sense of harmony and belonging. Okay, so I'm going to move over to the next video now to carry on discussing the invisible doctrine. So moving over to the next video now.